this thing on? All right. Well, welcome to, believe it or not, the 100th episode of the podcast.
Of our podcast, which definitely does exist.
Definitely.
And is 100% real.
Definitely does exist. I'm not sure why you can't listen to the other 99 episodes, but this is the 100th episode, so of course it's an anniversary edition. And as you know, per tradition, 100th anniversary means... Mailbag. So here's how it goes. You write in your questions. We give you our fantastic answers. By the way, my name is Josh.
And my name is Dave.
And we are both writers here at SwissVBS. I've been around here for, I think, 7 years now.
I've been here about 4 years.
And together, Dave and I have pretty much written training modules for everything under the sun, from all the way from tire physics to sales training to sexual harassment. Dave, am I missing anything?
No, that covers it.
Yeah, that's literally the three things we've ever written.
Yeah, the three things we do.
Yeah.
And everything in between.
All right, so why don't we cut to the chase, and maybe I'll start, Dave, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I'm looking at a giant pile of letters over here.
Fire up the mailbag. And
So let me start with our first one here. By the way, this was a write-in mail edition, so I'm sorry if you sent any emails in, but we only accept letters at this point. All right, Dave. Dear Dave, this letter comes to us from one Lothar W. from Cologne, Germany. Hello, Lothar.
Hi, Lothar.
Obviously a big fan of the podcast. Dear Dave, big fan of the podcast. I told you he was a big fan of the podcast. I have a question for you, Dave. Why is good writing so important in e-learning? That's a good one.
Well, thanks for the question, Lothar. I appreciate it. Clearly, you've put a lot of thought into that.
And he's a big fan, apparently.
Big fan. It's a good question. Why is good writing important to e-learning? I think of writing, it's kind of like acting in a movie. Josh, have you seen a movie recently called The Wife?
No, I haven't.
I don't think anybody saw it but me.
Okay.
Let me tell you, it's a
Is it about a wife?
It's about a wife.
Okay.
It stars Glenn Close. She was nominated for the Oscar for Best Actress. Didn't win. Won the Golden Globe for it. It's a terrible movie. It's terribly written, terribly constructed. It really is a bad film. But she is excellent in it. She's wonderful. And to me, that's what good writing can do, right? It's like good acting in that it can elevate so-so material into something wonderful. Conversely, bad writing can take the best material and make it really, really boring, right? And so, why is good writing important? I guess we have to define what good writing is, right? And to me, good writing means something that's lively, writing where there's thought put into every single word and phrase. Good writing also means clear writing, so writing that's easy to understand, maybe not in the sense of being simplistic or unintelligent, but in the sense of not writing words that get in the way of meaning just for the sake of sounding smart. And so again, to circle back, good writing is important in e-learning because it makes it interesting. It makes it easy to understand, and it elevates the material. I think something we often forget in e-learning is the cardinal rule of don't be boring.
Yeah.
It has to be interesting. And as I said, good writing can make any material interesting.
It's funny you say that, because I think you and I talk about this a lot, about how our role as writers is really about disrupting norms and beliefs about what e-learning is. I mean, if you tell anyone in a corporate setting it's time to take training, most of us go, oh, let me get through this, click, 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 and just kind of read and move on. And I really think our role as writers, especially in the nature of what we do, which is sort of rich media, engaging e-learning, is to really disrupt that stereotype and say, no, this is, like you said, interesting. And sometimes being interesting is all you really kind of need to do. Yes, you can accomplish your learning objectives, but at the same time, why can't you be a little bit more interesting at the same time? We live in this day and age where, it's so hard to grab people's attention. So I think it's the bare minimum that you try to be at least somewhat interesting when you do it. And I like the idea of making that comparison to actors, because I think that's a really good thing in terms of writing, because for me, the writing itself is almost a character in what you're trying to do, whether you think it or not. Maybe not always a formal character, like through, an actual character within a setting or whatever that is, but even the voice, the tone that you take on can make or break the difference in what you're trying to do.
Absolutely, and good writing doesn't necessarily mean writing a story in the sense of a narrative. It can just mean taking technical material and, phrasing it in such a way that it's interesting.
Yeah. Oh, that was a good question. Thank you, Lothar. Lothar W. from Cologne, Germany. Shout out Germany.
Speaking of good writing, let's read our next letter. So dig another one out of the mailbag. This one comes to us from Marcy in Ottawa. And Marcy writes, "Hey guys, I've never heard of your podcast, and quite frankly, I don't believe that it actually exists."
Well, this is our 100th episode, Marcy, so that's a little rude.
Clearly, if you're writing into our podcast, it exists. Nevertheless, she writes, "As a writer, I have a question about humor. What role does humor play in learning? How do you know when to use it? And how much is too much?"
Oh, that's a good one. Thanks a lot, Marcy. Shout out Ottawa. That's your hometown, isn't it?
It's my hometown.
Yeah, we got a couple of Ottawa people here. Who knew we had such a big subscriber base to our podcast in Ottawa, which does exist, by the way.
It definitely
Not
does.
the podcast, Ottawa. Yeah. Humor in e-learning, I think, that's a tricky one. I think you and I both know that we're really hilarious people, and we make a lot of jokes. Not necessarily on this podcast, but in our writing, we definitely do make a lot of jokes.
They're always funny.
And personally, I find you hilarious, Dave.
Thanks, Josh.
So when it comes to having to go through some of your writing sometimes and saying, well, you know what, I think this is a little too funny, Dave, it kind of hurts me to be able to cut that joke out and say you can't do it. But why do we use humor in e-learning? Well, kind of coming back to the point of being interesting, I think that's really what the idea is. Sometimes we work with really boring, dry material. And yes, you have to get through it. And yes, it's important from the context of your performance. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go about it in a very dry way. And I think that's really where humor can come in. But coming in and putting my kind of corporate hat on, I also know that there's limits to doing that. And if anyone of our podcast listeners are lawyers, then you know exactly why we probably can't do too much humor because, well, we have to be inclusive of all audiences. But I think that really comes back down to execution. I'm a big fan of dad humor in scripting, and that's really kind of coming up with sort of corny jokes. Sometimes a lot of puns. A good pun can go a long way. But I also think there's a time and place for executing it. And I think, Dave, you probably have some good examples and stuff that you've done recently where you've tried to incorporate humor or not.
Yeah, for me, the question of, how and when do you incorporate humor, how much is too much, to me, it's an issue of client management as well, right? And so if I am working on a project where I see there's a potential to do something really funny, first of all, that's what gets me really excited. Those are the projects I love. Mm-hmm. But secondly, I'm going to bring that forward in the design phase of a project to the client. Right when we're planning what we're going to do, I'm going to say, hey, how comfortable are you guys with humor? What's your corporate culture like? What are your learners like? Are they okay with that? Are you okay with that? Just so we don't throw them off when we get to the scripting phase, right? I don't want them to think it's a really serious sort of corporate-driven training and then all of a sudden there are these jokes in it that don't seem to belong. And so if I get the sign-off on that, when I'm scripting for the first time, I'll put in a few jokes, and maybe I'll even try to push the boundaries a little bit, and I'll flag those for the client and say, hey, this is what I was trying to do with this joke. Let me know what you think of this. Is this enough? Is this too much? Should I pull it back? Should I keep going with this tone? Yes or no? So I think it's really a matter of being transparent with the client and designing for humor.
Really weird thing. I'm just looking on the other side of Marcy's letter here, and apparently she has a follow-up question, and it says, "Dear Dave, I do know that you're quite hilarious, which is why I'm asking you this specifically."
Funny for someone who doesn't believe our podcast exists.
I know she's a fan of your writing apparently. But Marcy asks, "I believe that humor is important, but how do I convince my stakeholders that it's a necessary requirement?"
It's a really good question, Marcy. I think what we're always trying to do, as you said, Josh, is disrupt conventional learning, right? So a client might come in, especially a corporate client, with their mind made up about what they think they want, right? Yeah. And our role sometimes is to educate them and say, look, you might think your learners want this, but what we want to give them is learning that doesn't feel like conventional learning, right?
Or doesn't feel like learning at all.
Doesn't feel like learning at all, right? If you tell someone, okay, everyone, time to turn off your work and do your training now, their eyes glaze over, right? And so if we can give them something that feels not like doing training, but say watching, a sitcom or an episode of like a web series, that's something engaging, something they can look forward to. And I think humor can go a really long way to doing that, and that's how you can sell it to the client.
I think another way to approach it is to think of humor not necessarily as humor in a direct way. It's not like we're trying to do a stand-up routine here, but really it's about lightheartedness to ease the tension at times of particularly tough learning objectives or whatever that may be. And I think probably a good way to approach humor is really to think about it as less of writing and scripting and more of experience design. And to think of humor as something that can be conceptually applied rather than one-off jokes. I think one-off jokes tend to stand out more, especially when you're talking about something very serious. But if the premise of your experience has a humorous tone to it, I think that can help be a little bit more subtle, but at the same time also help make it a little bit more lighthearted.
And at the end of the day, it's the client's initiative, and you can sell it all you want, but at the end of the day, they want something that's really straightforward and serious, so be it.
Yeah.
And you can bank those jokes, you can bank that hilarious satirical premise and use it in the future.
Well, I know that you take all your scrap jokes and you kind of go to Second City down the street and just try them out, so they don't always work.
I'm here.
But you're hilarious in the
here every day,
e-learning
folks.
circuit. You're hilarious in the e-learning circuit. All right, I think we have time for one more question. So, Dave, why don't you, do you want to grab one? Or maybe I'll grab one.
Sure,
Let me grab one from the pile here. Let me see what I've got here. Oh, this one is a doozy, I think. Okay. All right. Dear Dave. Wow, this is like, do I not exist on this podcast? Dear Dave, I wouldn't consider myself to be a writer, but I do want to get better at my writing. So Dave, once again, rude, what's the one tip you can give me to write better, or something that's going to fix my writing right now? Oh, sorry, I don't know who this letter is from. Hold on, let me see who it's from. Oh, that's weird. Lotar W. from Toronto, Canada.
Funny.
That's weird. I wonder if that's the same person.
Yeah, what's he doing in Cologne and Toronto? Postmarking.
Pick a city, Lotar. Jeez.
Anyway, thanks, Lotar. Whether it's the same person or a different one, thank you for your question. It's a good question. What's one tip to help you fix your writing? Well, the bad news is there's not really one tip I can give you. It's, learning to write well is a process. It takes years, it takes a lot of practice. But if there's one piece of advice I can give you, it's to read, and read widely. To me, that's how you learn to write.
That's a great one.
You read good writing. It doesn't mean you have to pick specific things that are about writing, but you need to look at how you need to read writing that has well-constructed sentences and get those rhythms in your head. They have to live within you. And the more you do that, the more you can develop that voice for writing clear and concise sentences.
Whenever I think about some of the best writing that I read, for me, I'm always amazed by how simple the writing is. And when I think about my writing process, as you know, I tend to be an overwriter rather than an underwriter, and I go through several drafts and a lot of editing and probably a lot of tears too by the end of it as well. But for me, I'm always appreciative of how good writing is really just about simple, short sentences. And I think sometimes we get confused when we think we need to write well and what we think writing well means, and we think it's about bringing out the thesaurus. Does the thesaurus still exist? Probably not. Saying, I need to pick the best words possible and, put it in the longest run-on sentences possible and try and impress the audience. And really, it's about communicating ideas. And sometimes communicating the idea is doing it in the simplest way possible rather than in the most complex way possible.
I think sometimes people sit down and they get into writing mode. They put on their writer hat, and they want to sound really intelligent. They want to sound professional, and that's totally understandable. But I think what often ends up happening is then you end up using really complex phraseology. You use long words, long sentences, words that don't need to be there just to make it sound intelligent. When really, the complexity should come in the ideas, not in the language.
That's a great
Good
point.
writing is complex ideas delivered in a way that's very clear and easy to understand.
Yeah. I think one thing that actually helps me write a lot is actually this thing online called Hemingway. And it's a desktop app, but I think you can download it as well too. But the cool thing about Hemingway is that it actually scores your writing in real time. So you can copy and paste your writing and put it in there, and it can help you with things like sentence structure, redundancy. So it's not even about spelling and grammar. It's really about structure and tone and voice. Dave, do you have any other things that you think work to help you become a better writer?
I was just going to ask, I've never heard of Hemingway, but does it drink whiskey with you also?
I mean, I think that's the premium version.
I guess what I could do is offer a few texts that I go back to often when I want to be inspired to write well. One of them is Strunk and White's The Elements of Style.
Oh, that's a great one.
Yeah, it's the Bible of how to write concisely. And in that book, they cite one of my favorite essays of the English language. It's by George Orwell, called Politics in the English Language. It is a widely anthologized classic of the 20th century. And in that essay, toward the end, he gives rules for how to write well, and one of them, and I love this, is to go through your writing and take out any word that is not necessary.
Yeah.
So paring it down, taking out all the fat,
That's
leaving
great.
just the muscle there.
Especially in light of, our micro-learning fad. I think that's especially important. I think you and I both have that challenge when we need to take 5 minutes of information and spit out a 40-second, 50-second script. And so every word counts there. I think that's really just one of our mantras when we're writing, is really finding that specific word to help you get that idea across. That's the challenge, but it's also part of the practice of it.
Absolutely. And then the other touchstones I go back to, I guess, are other famous pieces of prose writing in English. So Martin Luther King's Letter from Birmingham Jail.
Oh, yeah.
It's wonderful, and you read it and you can't help but marvel at the sentence construction. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, and if you really want to nerd it up, Samuel Johnson's preface to his Dictionary of the English Language from 1755.
Call back to 1755. Wow. Is that a favorite of yours?
It is a favorite of mine.
Yeah.
He took 10 years to write the first dictionary of the English language all by himself.
Wow.
And he wrote this preface where he talks about the language of English. It's wonderful, and it's so beautifully written.
That's a deep cut, Dave, for
Thanks.
sure.
Thanks, John.
And I think probably to sort of wrap up that point, I'd just say stick with it and practice. It is something that takes a very long time to do, and it's okay if the first few versions aren't your best. Like I said, I'm a huge draft writer. I write in lots of drafts, and the first draft is never ready. So, meanwhile, Dave is a much better sort of first draft writer, and he's a lot better writer than me, folks.
Well, I like to edit as I write.
Yeah.
So it's hard for me to distinguish between a first draft, second draft, third draft. I'll write, and then as I'm writing, I'm constantly going back and editing what I've already written.
All right. Well, I think that's all the time we have for today. Thanks again for listening in to our 100th episode of our Very Real podcast.
And thanks to everyone who wrote in with those excellent questions.
Yeah, especially Lothar, who apparently has written from 2 different countries, if they are the exact same person. But next time, we'll be doing a live scripting of a module on compliance, won't we, Dave?
We absolutely will. So
in our 100% Real podcast, which would technically be our 101st.
Stay tuned for the next episode.
Talk to you soon.
Bye, everybody.